Hey, Cypher here, and yes, we're doing another big collab. This time, it's getting revolutionary. No? Eh? Okay, fine. So yeah, everybody is talking about revolutions. Before me was Canubis, who was talking about the 18th century scientific revolution. And after me is Ancient Accounts, who's doing the French Revolution. So check out the playlist if you aren't already on it. If you are, then it's time to talk about what a true blue-blooded American cares about.
Woo! America! Home of the free and land of the brave, where the Founding Fathers set off the revolutionary new republic, for which it still stands. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. They signed that Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, and the world just got a bit more liberated as a result. That's kind of a myth, and we all know it. Even the Declaration of Independence wasn't solely signed on July 4th. It was passed on July 2nd, and not even completely signed until the 2nd of August. John Adams, who I will remind you was one of those signatories, even complained about people celebrating the 4th, saying, "The 2nd day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival." Yeah, that's the 2nd of July, not the 4th. Even that whole signing picture we see everywhere is false, since it took a month to get everyone to attend the meetings long enough to sign the dang thing, and the delivery of the Declaration took another 3 months. The whole 4th of July thing arose simply because of the Declaration's publication date. Kinda a letdown if you ask me. Somebody slapped a date on a thing and that's what we're celebrating? Well, you gotta have some day to celebrate, right? But there are deeper problems with that mythology, some of which may jeopardize the very concept of that time being revolutionary. So let's get some things straight. The War of Independence didn't begin with the intention of gaining independence. It started because a bunch of fighting happened in Massachusetts, stemming from the Intolerable Acts, a full year before independence was declared. There had been steady disaffection and conflict since the 7 Years' War ended in 1763. But the Continental Congress, and consequently the Continental Army, wasn't organized to fight for independence. That came later. So this whole idea of American nationalism beginning with 1776 is total bunk from the get-go. Independence was declared, but a third of the United States population were loyalists. Even many of the founders migrated back to Britain after the war. This fledgling republic had a lot of aches and pains to grow out of, and the idea of everyone considering themselves full-blooded Americans is rather laughable in hindsight. Yeah, independence was won in 1783, and eventually the Constitution was created in 1787 and ratified in 1789, but the American people were still a loosely confederated batch of various citizenries. It took until the Civil War, 7 years later, for proper nationalism to develop. One could say the Civil War was a birth of a nation. D.W. Griffith was completely racist and factually inaccurate, but he wasn't wrong in the name of the film. So the chronology of our revolution is off, at least in the general public's mind. And the nationalism bit of the myth is incorrect. But still, how could anyone say 1776 wasn't revolutionary? Well, that requires understanding the general historiography of the revolution, as in what historians have written about it over the years. There are 4 general schools of thought. The first are obviously the nationalists. People like George Bancroft and later Orthodox historians emphasized the enormity of the occasion. They saw 1776 as a watershed moment, where the anger at Britain climaxed with a complete rupture from their history to ours. This Whig interpretation, as it's called, argues that the revolution was truly revolutionary because it took a massive step towards freedom and liberty, setting an example for the rest of the world. Across the Atlantic, British historians had a different take. They basically portrayed the colonies as a bunch of whiny aristocrats who didn't know how good they had it, so they bit the hand that fed them. This is called the Imperial School.
Oh yes, look at those colonists, acting as though they did anything. They truly have us British people to thank for what they have done. They're just ungrateful.
Long live the king.
In this way, it wasn't a revolution, but just a power grab by the greedy colonists who didn't appreciate the lengths Britain had gone for them. These rudimentary positions evolved over the decades. Progressive historians in the early 20th century argued that there was some aspect of economic incentive driving 1776. Charles Beard in particular made the most famous version of this, basically saying that there were two revolutions. First of anti-monarchism, and second of bourgeois property rights. Essentially, the Declaration of Independence fought monarchism, and the Constitution was a proclamation of property rights. But all of these interpretations were fundamentally flawed. They attributed revolutionary changes where there were none. The economic changes were negligible. Freedom and liberty were not discernibly different from most citizens of the US, let alone non-citizens like women and slaves. And no nation was born in 1776. Heck, even the imperialists were factually incorrect in their assessment of American indebtedness. What became the United States was built by the colonists and their victims. Britain only sent them and ruled over them, and often hindered that process. So finally, there was the revisionist school. This came with the rise of the New Left. They re-examined these grand narratives and ultimately argued that the revolution was not that revolutionary. You see, the idea of a revolution requires revolutionary change. When compared to the craziness of a lot of other revolutions, such as the French one only a decade afterward, the American Revolution seems relatively tame. Many revisionists call 1776 a conservative revolution, knowing full well that's a contradiction in terms. A revolution has to be revolutionary. As Webster's dictionary says, a revolution is a sudden, radical, or complete change, or a fundamental change in political organization. So a conservative revolution is a contradiction because conservation is the opposite of radical change. By calling it that, revisionists are arguing that the American Revolution was not a revolution. So why not? Well, the social, political, and economic order didn't change very much. Most of the states kept their political structure exactly as it was. The war began over taxation, and afterwards, they were simply being taxed differently. The most powerful people in the colonies who stayed were the most powerful people in the states after the Revolution. Even the property rights system was simply preserving what had come before. No new economic class arose, no group identity came to prominence, and life kept moving as normal. The early republic was awfully similar to the colonial period in every significant way. Where was the break? What was so historically significant? Where was this sudden, radical, or complete change? A faraway parliament no longer ruled the colonies, but the states had their own version. What's the difference? But of course, this pessimism hasn't stayed. In the 1990s, books on the Founding Fathers were selling like hotcakes. These folks often told very orthodox history, with triumphal tales of the founders and their exploits. They promoted that nationalism idea that was basically the foundation of the history profession in the 19th century. This is selective memory, of course, forgetting the vast majority of people for the sake of a few elites. But there are other ways of reviving the revolutionary narrative without resorting to defunct interpretations. Post-revisionists emphasize nuance and ambiguity. To diffuse the whole question, all you have to say is, was Napoleon that different from Louis XVI? Was Lenin that different from Nicholas II? Were the changes these true revolutions sudden, radical, or complete? It's easy to make the same argument about most revolutions as revisionists have made for the American one, but we can take that a step further by rephrasing the question. Rather than looking at whether or not 1776 was a true revolution, we can ask instead, how revolutionary was the American Revolution? Now we're getting somewhere. Let's look internationally first. While anti-monarchism was by no means a new thing, American independence inspired numerous other independence movements. The Dutch Republic had people invoking the American Revolution almost immediately, literally calling themselves patriots. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man had many connections to the American Declaration, including influence from its author. Spanish possessions throughout the Americas rose up constantly, almost all of which invoked the American Revolution. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence have been reformulated for hundreds of independence movements. Here, look at North Vietnam's declaration in 1945. It starts by saying, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples of the earth are equal from birth, all the peoples have a right to live, to be happy, and be free. Yep, that's a communist nation invoking the Declaration to proclaim independence. So yeah, I think the Declaration is quite revolutionary. But there's a deeper part of the Declaration that is perhaps even more revolutionary, and that's the first paragraph. We tend to think of the first paragraph as simply proclaiming the US as independent, but it is actually putting forth an argument. Jefferson says, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." It's arguing that jus gentium, or the law of nations, which were the 18th century ideals of international relations, applies to people who no longer consent to be governed. I do have to point out, nation means something different here. It simply means country, not the people within it. A king is a nation in this conception of the term.
I am France and France is me!
Our version of nationalism wouldn't come about until a century later. Jefferson's first paragraph is actually a legally sophisticated statement, but as the British replied, they are subversive of every actual or imaginable kind of government. Ah, Bentham, you silly rascal. Of course they're subversive. That's the point. But it's also subversive to the evolution of jus gentium, because natural law was on its way out for more realistic ones that said they were made by humans. But Jefferson brought natural laws back with a vengeance. Instead of people speaking of positive rights, like how Bentham would have it, people now speak of natural rights, as if that's a given, and the American Revolution cemented it there. So yeah, the American Revolution has a huge effect on how we define rights. I'd call that revolutionary. But this is international stuff. Let's talk about the early republic. The Declaration isn't actually law, so invoking it as part of our Constitution is incorrect. You'll find a lot of people who reference the Declaration as if it has any bearing on law today, but it doesn't. The Constitution, on the other hand, does. And it was revolutionary in and of itself. While the United States wasn't the first constitutional republic, our Constitution was basically different from anything that came before. The British still have no formal constitution, but there was a basic sense of checks and balances. Montesquieu argued for a more comprehensive version, based on John Locke's ideas of property and Thomas Hobbes' idea of a social contract. There were even influences from previous experiments in democracy, from the colonies and American Indian confederations. That crazy soup of ideas were brought together and implemented with the US Constitution. That is a drastic change. No one had done that before, and the world took notice. Constitutionality, checks and balances, and private property rights are the revolutionary changes of the US Constitution. Plus, the innovation of a bicameral legislature and independent states were organic developments from the previous Articles of Confederation. Brilliant stuff. So how revolutionary was the American Revolution? I think calling it a conservative revolution is inaccurate, but maybe we can call it a liberal one, and the beginning of the bourgeois world revolution. Judging by its impact, I dare say a lot was revolutionary. It doesn't matter what happened later. Whether 20th century communism collapsed, the October Revolution is no less of a revolution. Similarly, the effects of the American Revolution itself can be felt all around the world today, and certainly in the American people, not simply by virtue of US hegemony, but by virtue of the revolutionary changes beginning in 1776. The American Revolution was quite revolutionary, just not in the way it is typically depicted. With certain inalienable, god damn, that's hard to say.
Woo, it's a whim for freedom and whatnot.